All right, I'll share here. Um, all right. Can folks see the screen? Is that showing up okay? Yeah. Uh, actually, wait, this is the wrong, sorry, wrong one. Here we go. This is what I want to show. Um, there we go. Can all folks see this, the Book of Daniel? Great, great. All right. Well, I'll just open us with getting us back up to speed, and I'll open us in prayer, and then I'll jump into the material for today. So let me open us in prayer, and I can check in and see if folks have questions as well. So, gracious God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this time, this Lenten season to prepare us for Easter and the newness of life. We thank you that during Lent, there's an encouragement for us to think about things that might be difficult or hard or things that own up to and are honest about the difficult things in life. We thank you that in the midst of difficulties, you promise to be there, even all the way to the cross, in which you fully embraced our pain at its deepest point. Gracious God, we thank you for your presence in all places of our lives. We thank you for your solidarity with us, that you promise that we will never face things alone. But God, we often seem to face things alone, and we often feel alone. Even Jesus on the cross said, my God, why have you abandoned me?" God, in those moments of the fear of abandonment, in those moments where we feel like we are alone, give us the faith of Daniel. Give us courage to trust that you are there, nevertheless, working in the background of history on a large scale, but also even in the stories of our lives. Amen. All right. So before we jump into our material for today, which will be on apocalyptic literature, which is going to be, this is the spicy stuff of the Bible. Let me just stop and say, are there any questions from things that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks? We talked about Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 3, and then last week, we really covered chapters 4 through 6 and ended with the lion's den. Any questions or comments? And no worries if there's not, but this is just a chance to check in. All right, great. So if you have questions during today, feel free to raise your hand or just even shout out. I'll be listening. Our material for today is jumping into the second half of the book of Daniel. So one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning of our time together a few weeks ago was that Daniel was a book in two parts or two halves, really, chapters 1 through 6 and then 7 through 12. Chapters 1 through 6, which we've been talking about so far, were written during the period of the exile and then into the time of the Persian period or the Persian kingdom's reign. And this is often called the time of the post-exilic period or the time of the restoration, some folks will call it. But Jerusalem was rebuilt as a city, but many Jews continued to live in areas outside of the land of Israel, outside of Jerusalem. So those folks like Esther stayed in Persian lands. Those folks like Ezra and Nehemiah, they stayed in Babylon and in the Persian capital of Persepolis. There were many Jews that lived in Egypt during this time, and Jews that were scattered abroad to Greece and the Greek lands, and even as far as Italy and Rome. So Jews were scattered around all over the place, and the book of Daniel is attempting to address that problem. So chapters 1 through 6 are all about the experience of being a Jew as a minority within a majority population that is not very happy with the difference that is created or the tension that's created by Jews not obeying all of the rules of the dominant culture. So we talked about last week chapters 4 through 6, the kind of education of the kings. So the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, really says that the exile happened and the diaspora happened, the spreading of the Jewish people happened in order to educate and transform the cultures into which they had been placed. So it's this kind of global sense of bringing a message of Yahweh, the King of the universe. This evangelism, we might think of it in a Christian sense, right? This bringing of the news of Yahweh was understood to really be effective in these bureaucratic situations, with the king even. So that is to say that chapters 1 through 6 encourage Jews to maintain their faith even when their faith sets them apart, sets them up as a target, makes people jealous of them, but also scared of them for being different and standing out. And what seems to be their great weakness, their Achilles heel, that is, the parts of their faith that are um, that 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 really don't conform or assimilate to the dominant culture, uh, that those are actually their source of great strength. That's the claim, and that another big claim is that it seems like if you look around the world, like Yahweh is not important, or that Yahweh has lost or died in battle against the Babylonian king, that it'd be ridiculous to be a Jew following this God and putting everything on the line to be able to follow a God who is asking you to stick out and be different and not worship other deities and things like that. So there's a lot of um, kind of competing voices out there, and in the midst of all of that, how is it that Jews actually, among all of these ancient peoples, they 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 didn't kind of regain their kingdom in any real sense. Um, there were some brief periods of local rule after this, but they managed to keep their personhood, their identity, their national identity, even if without a nation. And this was in large part because of the stories of Daniel and Esther and Nehemiah, these stories that encouraged Jews to maintain their identity and also maintain their faith in Yahweh's sovereignty in the midst of all evidence to the contrary. Okay, so that's Daniel chapters 1 through 6, the sovereignty of God, even when it doesn't seem like it, and God's kind of historical, like long-term historical working through the world, and especially through people who do not seem to be powerful or strong. These marginal Jews end up being the ones that God works through in order to save the world. So this particular uh, kind of a what we might think of as like a constellation of ideas and images continued to be very important, but the world changed. So not everything stayed the same. We're going to talk about a major event or series of events that happened starting in the year 300 BC that ended up transforming Judaism and transformed Jewish texts, Jewish biblical texts. So, starting sometime around the year 300 BC, some Jews revisited these stories of Daniel that had become very popular and very important and kind of a centerpiece or a foundation for their faith, revisited these stories, but they needed to tell them again and tell them differently because things had changed. So, starting with chapter 7 of Daniel, we get like a second round of Daniel stories that were written after the time of chapters 1 through 6. We know this in part because a large portion of chapters 7 through 12 is written in a different language. So, chapters 2 through 6 are written in Aramaic, and chapter 7 is also written in Aramaic. This was a language that was forced on people. That the peoples of the world had to use the Aramaic language to talk to each other and to the Persian king. It was the Persians that forced everyone to write in Aramaic. The Persians only started to do this sometime around the year 500 BC. So that's how we know that chapters 2 through 7 of the book of Daniel at least originated sometime around 500 BC or later. But chapters 8 through 12 of the book of Daniel were written in Hebrew. And they were not written in good Hebrew. They were written in bad Hebrew. That is to say, somebody relearned Hebrew and then wrote in it. We know that this happened. This was part of a resurgent nationalism within kind of almost like like an indigenous nationalism within the people who Jews who lived in the land of Judah, who lived in the area around Jerusalem, starting really in the Hellenistic period. So starting sometime around the year 200 BC, Jews began to relearn Hebrew as a literary language and write in it. They did this in order to protest the Greek kingdoms that surrounded them and that dominated them. So that learning to speak in their ancient indigenous tongue and write in their ancient indigenous tongue was an act of resistance. And that's the kind of Hebrew that we read in chapters 8 through 12 of the book of Daniel, these apocalyptic chapters. So this is a lot of evidence that we've got these two halves of Daniel. They're written in two different languages. They're written at two different times. They really address two different historical contexts. Chapters 1 through 6 really address the Babylonian and then Persian context. And chapters 7 through 12, they really confront a world that has been dominated by Greek kingdoms that for the first time ever have asserted their power over the ancient Near East, over Egypt, over the land of Judah, but also even as far as Bactria or modern day Tibet. In any event, this is what we'll talk about. But these connections, there are a bunch of connections between these two sections as well, and that's this assertion that despite appearances, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is actually the creator of the world and remains in charge of the world, and that this God works behind the scenes. This God works in ways that requires wisdom to be able to see, and that wisdom can only be given by that God. So you can't be smart enough to figure out the history of the world and understand really where God is at work in it unless you have the eyes of faith. So those are some pieces that connect these two different sections of the book. And that's why Daniel was really chosen as this vehicle for further conversation and further reflection on the power of God in the midst of a world dominated by foreign powers. All right, so this new bit of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, was written in a new genre. So the genre or type of literature of chapters 1 through 6 was the court tale, stories of Jews working in the courts of foreign kings, and they would make some of their rivals mad, and the rivals would try to kill them, and then they would be saved by God. That's basically chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel. Every chapter is a little bit of a different variation on that motif. Starting with chapter 7, we lose those court tales. They're not stories anymore about like foreign Jews in the court of a foreign king having competitions with their Babylonian rivals. That disappears entirely. Instead, we get visions, like visions that seem to be terrifying, that really scare Daniel. And they're all about Daniel's recounting of these really strange visions that he has. His friends vanish. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're gone. Daniel 7 through 12 starts to think less about the experience of Jews in foreign lands and really focuses exclusively on the temple in Jerusalem. So it's a very different setting that we're seeing here and a very different concern. But the most striking difference is this genre or the type of literature. So starting with chapter 7, we just hear about these visions, and these visions are in a very particular style. It reads a lot like the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation in the New Testament that finishes the Bible borrows heavily from the imagery and the structure of these visions in Daniel chapters 7 through 12. And we think that Daniel 7 through 12 was part of this new type of literature that the world had never seen before. That really begins sometime around the year 300 BC, and we call this apocalyptic. Apocalypse is a Greek word. It comes from a Greek word that means to unveil or reveal something. So it's really about revelation. And it's this special kind of revelation. God is going to reveal a lot of secrets about the world that are impossible to see without divine eyes in this very special way. And that special way is that an angel is going to explain some strange and terrifying visions that an individual has had. And that individual is Daniel in the book of Daniel. In the book of Revelation, that's St. John, John of Patmos. It's not clear that's the John of the Gospel of John that's traditionally associated with that gospel. But Revelation and the Gospel of John seem to be written in a similar style, so there's probably some connection there. Nonetheless, Daniel is an apocalyptic book, but also Enoch, the books of First and Second Enoch. You may have heard of these. There's also a Third Enoch. They were very important at the time of Jesus, but they ended up decreasing in their importance when the Bible was really being kind of assembled as a collection of texts with a table of contents. The books of Enoch became less popular, and now they're not canonical in any Christian or Jewish tradition except for Ethiopian Orthodox traditions, which do have Enoch as a canonical book. But Enoch, the beginnings of the book of Enoch, which the name is taken from Genesis 5, the guy who walked and then was no more. In the year 300, right about, many Jews began to think about this character Enoch, and begin to write almost like fan fiction about him, like extra stories about Enoch and visions that Enoch had. And in those stories that they eventually were collected together, and those sound a lot like the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12. They're apocalyptic visions. There were other apocalyptic visions that were written down. There are actually dozens in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they didn't make it into the Bible, but they were considered important and considered perhaps even sacred by many Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. And the book of Jude, in fact, cites one of these apocalyptic texts as scripture, and that's the Apocalypse of Moses, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's actually cited by Jude, and Jude actually refers to the book of Enoch as well as scripture. So there's a bit of the Bible, and the book of Jude's in the New Testament. So there's a bit of the Bible that actually treats some of these apocalyptic texts outside of the book of Daniel, these other apocalyptic texts that are contemporaneous as scripture. So all to say that there was this huge explosion of apocalyptic thinking in Jewish culture right around the same time, this period of Greek dominance after the time of Alexander the Great, which I'll talk about more in just a moment. We can say that apocalyptic literature is a genre. So an apocalypse, it's a type of literature, and it follows a very specific set of it's got a specific structure. So a person sees a crazy vision, and an angel comes and explains it to them, and it has to do with the end of stuff. And I'll explain more about that in just a minute. And it reveals some truth about God and about God's authority over the world, and especially God's authority over foreign empires. We can also say that there's an apocalyptic theology that comes from this apocalyptic literature, but which can show up in other places. So I wouldn't call the Gospels an apocalypse. Like the Gospel of Luke is not an apocalypse, but it has some apocalyptic ideas in it. Or like Paul's letters are not apocalyptic in terms of like being they're not an apocalypse, but they have apocalyptic ideas in them, things about how the end of time is coming and God is going to judge the world soon. We find those in the Gospels. We find those in Paul's thought and so on. We'll deal more with the implications of all of that being in Christian texts and being really important for Christian texts over the next couple of weeks. But today, I'll just introduce that idea. So we have apocalyptic kind of theology or apocalyptic thought or apocalyptic imagery that shows up in all sorts of texts. But really, the genre of apocalypse, like a literary apocalypse, only shows up really twice in the Bible, and that's Daniel chapters 7 through 12, and then the book of Revelation. Those are our two real apocalypses in the Bible. So there are some things that characterize apocalyptic literature. So there is this revelation of these cosmic secrets that only God can know. Sometimes secrets about the kind of the structure of the cosmos, like what do the heavens look like and things like this. And sometimes it's a revelation of like cosmic secrets about time. It's usually about space or time or both. So revelation of like what is actually going on in the cosmos, or how in the world is God possibly working in the midst of all of this chaos? How does history make sense? That's a big question. And these are cosmic secrets that only God can know and that only God can reveal. They are revealed to a human recipient. So there's always a person who sees some visions or hears some things or experiences some things that are strange. And then the person doesn't understand, and an angel has to come and explain it. One really important thing about the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, is it's the first time in the Bible, the earliest books in the Bible that mention angels by name. And we get Michael and Gabriel. So we get these two names of angels. There's other names of angels that begin to emerge during the same time. The angel Raphael shows up in the book of Tobit. Rapha means to heal, and he's a healing angel in the book of Tobit, Raphael. Michael is like a attacking angel in the book of Daniel, kind of a commander of the armies. And Mikael, the name, means who is like God. In other words, Michael's actually not God, so don't worship Michael. And Gabriel is God is my hero. So Gabriel's hero is God, and Gabriel is like kind of a warrior angel as well. But don't worship me. Don't worship the angels. Don't worship the angels. Aren't great. Their names are even trying to say that like God is the one who does all these things. Oh, and Raphael, the healing angel, his name is El or God heals. Rapha, El. Rapha means to heal, and El means God. God is the one who heals, not the angel. The reason that these angels aren't named in the rest of the Old Testament, they show up as anonymous beings, is that ancient Israelites were really scared about worshiping other deities other than Yahweh. And I mean, Michael and Gabriel are angelic beings. They're divine-ish beings. They're kind of like gods. They're like mini gods. So ancient Israelites were really worried about worshiping other gods. Don't worship other gods is a mantra over and over again. By the time in the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, Jews had become a little bit more comfortable with the idea of naming the helper deities who help Yahweh and serve Yahweh. They were less worried about worshiping these as divine creatures or making temples to the angels. Um, Nonetheless, you see the names of the angels. Who is like God? God is my hero. God is the healer. That is to say that there's an anxiety about these creatures that we don't really want to worship them. We don't want to talk about them too much. But nonetheless, it's an important thing for us to note that in the apocalypses, we start to see a lot more information about not only divine beings that are good, angels that serve Yahweh. We also start to see a lot of stuff about demons. If you look through the rest of the Old Testament, you don't see a whole lot about demons. They don't talk about them because they don't want you to worship them. Because every ancient people that we know of worshiped demons. They sacrificed to demons. They gave demons food to make the demons go away, and they told demons nice things so that the demons would leave them alone because they were scared of them. So Babylonians did this, Egyptians did this, Canaanites did this. And in the Bible, they say, don't worship the demons. Don't talk about the demons. So they don't really, they say that a couple of times, but they don't really talk about demons. They don't want you to think about them. They want you to just worship God. By the time you get to Daniel, again, Jews are a little more comfortable with the idea of monotheism at that point. And just like they start talking about angels, they start talking about evil creatures. There must be some evil creatures out there in the world. And in fact, next week, we'll talk a little bit about the origins of the devil, which the beginning of thinking about something being kind of like the devil emerges at this time. Now, you may say, I thought the devil was all over the Old Testament. Not really. And we can talk about that next week as well. But so, all to say, God sends these visions to a person who gets terrified and can't understand them. And an angel, a messenger of God, has to come and interpret them for this person. And these dreams or visions are full of vivid symbolic imagery, and that needs to be interpreted for them. There's also the sense of determinism in all of these visions that people get. Apocalyptic literature is deterministic. What that means is that God is in charge. God is sovereign, and God has already decided how history is going to go. And so God can tell you the future because God's already decided what the future is going to be. So that is to say, it's not really up to you. A major, major claim of apocalyptic literature is that you are not in charge. It's not up to you. If you look at the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, the only thing that people who are faithful are told to do is just keep the faith. That's it. You're not told to save anyone. You're not told to attack the enemy. You're not told to like defend things. They're sit tight and keep the faith. That's all you're told to do. And the whole point is that God is already in charge. God is the one who's going to save us. So this deterministic kind of theology, God is in control, God is sovereign. And there's all these kind of, along with vivid symbolic imagery, all this kind of numbers and codes and even like references to ancient myths. We see some like they borrow myths from ancient Canaanites and things like this, and they kind of twist them around to make them more Yahwistic. That is to say, to fit more with their ideas of who Yahweh is and how Yahweh works. But there's these kind of like almost like these stories from the ancient myths of the deep past, and they kind of recover these ancient stories and reuse them in their apocalyptic literature, probably to make this literature seem even more mystical, even more scary, or like a horror movie or something. So also we get this dualism, good versus evil. Now, the Old Testament is not typically dualistic. That is to say that the Old Testament does not depict the world as a site of conflict between good spirits and bad spirits. The Old Testament depicts the world as a space that God has ordered and that God alone is in charge of. And the chaos monsters are not demons in the Bible, in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the chaos monsters are the people. Like the humans are the chaos monsters. We're the agents of chaos. Now there's a serpent in Genesis, chapter 3. We all know the serpent, right? Who deceives Eve and so on. But that serpent is not like the main character of the story. It's not even named there. It doesn't come up. It doesn't pop up again. I mean, Paul refers to it in the New Testament, but the Old Testament doesn't really talk about this creature again. There's the book of Job. You say, the devil's in the book of Job. Um, the ending of the book of Job, God says, I did it. I did the whole thing. I brought all this terrible stuff onto you. And Job says, you did it, God. You did all this terrible stuff. And even the beginning of the book of Job, Job says, the Lord gave, the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. There's another saying that occurs a lot in the Old Testament, which is that the Lord heals and the Lord wounds, and then the Lord binds up, or the Lord wounds and the Lord heals. That is to say that part of the really important claim of monotheism for ancient Jews was that God does everything, the good and the bad alike. God does everything, the good and the bad alike. Why did the Babylonian disaster happen, the exile? It wasn't a demon that did it. It was God who did it. God decided to do this. So that is to say that this is a really important claim for them throughout the whole Old Testament, except by the time you get to the book of Daniel, something happened that broke their theology. Something happened that destroyed their way of thinking about God, and they had to rebuild it. I don't know if that makes sense, but one second. Let me um, okay, sorry, thanks. Okay, so there were all these stories, we might say, that other cultures had about how terrifying creatures fought against gods or the gods. So the Babylonians had stories about chaos monsters that were attacking the gods. The Egyptians had stories about different gods that kind of chaos demons that were trying to fight. Seth, if you remember the stories of Egypt that you've heard before, like Horus versus Seth. Seth is a chaos monster who really kind of embodies like the winds that blow in the sands, like these kind of sandstorms and the chaos of the desert. You can die easily in the desert. So that's what Seth exemplifies. Uh, we don't find that in the Old Testament. We don't find a Seth. We don't find a Tiamat, this kind of chaos monster that you find in ancient Canaanite literature and in ancient Babylonian literature that tries to destroy the world with chaos. Really, we find people being the bad ones in the Old Testament until we get to Daniel. And so this thing that happened, this moment of fracture in Jewish faith that required a new kind of theology, this is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. It ends up forming a dualism. What they end up saying is there's a bad, evil force out there, and it has to be there has to be something that fights against God. Okay, another thing that's important about these texts is that they are all pseudepigraphal. Pseudepigraphy, that means like it's like somebody's using a pen name. Now, we today might think of this as lying. This is not how the ancient writers thought about it. You would write in the name of famous people all the time in the ancient world. It was understood to be that you were like writing in kind of a tradition that was associated with a really important person. They didn't have copyright back then. They didn't like have library card catalogs. This idea of like authorial ownership. No one got paid for their writing in the ancient world, so you weren't like stealing someone's intellectual property. IP didn't exist in the ancient world, so they don't have a sense that you're stealing someone's name and using it. Writing in someone else's name was a common thing to do, and most writing was really for a small group of people who knew you very well already. So if you wrote in the name of someone, an ancient past figure, the point of it was that you were kind of claiming, in a way, lineage from somebody. So writing in the name of Daniel, that is to say, if you write stories about Daniel that are in Daniel's voice, there's only a few people that can write in Jerusalem at this time. Everyone knows who the other people are that they're writing for, and everyone knows who's writing these texts. But they're claiming this connection to Daniel, and the reason I think that someone would write a story about a vision and write it in the name of Daniel is that Daniel is famous for having faith in God in the midst of an empire that is trying to eradicate his faith. So we'll come back to that later. But I think that's why Daniel is so important for these folks a couple hundred years later that end up rewriting stories in Daniel's name, chapter 7 through 12. couple other things, motivational. These texts are all motivational. They're trying to get you to do something, but that thing they're trying to get you to do is just keep the faith. Keep the faith. Don't give up. Don't lose your faith. That's it. They're not trying to get you to fight. They're not trying to get you to win. They're just trying to get you to not give up. This periodization of time, a really important thing about apocalyptic literature is that it takes the chaos of history and tries to form neat little segments of time that make sense. So when we look back at the chaotic past today, a big part of historians' jobs is to come up with neat, tidy packages of time that make sense of chaos. So the real truth of history is actually chaotic. So we talk about the Industrial Revolution as this moment in time that makes a lot of sense and that has a beginning and a middle and an end. And there was the invention of the steam engine, and there was the creation of the railroads and the creation of the factory, and then Ford comes along with Fordism and this idea of the factory, and then we get Levittown, and we get like the formation of suburban culture, right? It makes a whole lot of sense. The actual world did not happen in a way that made a lot of sense to people. There were a lot of people who did not understand what the Industrial Revolution was as they were living it. There were people who continued to be subsistence farmers with no access to machines or factories or factory products the entire time that the Industrial Revolution was happening. There were poor farmers who made everything they had by their own hands until the 20th century. So that is to say that there's this unevenness to time, and that time makes sense in retrospect, but we have to cut out a whole lot of nonsense to make time make sense. But we now looking back can tell the history of the world in a way that makes sense to us from our perspective. And the reason that we study history is because it helps us to think about who we are now and who we're going to be. It helps give us a sense of a plot that then helps us to anticipate what's coming next. That's really why we study history, to not just understand the past, but to understand our present, how'd we get here, and to understand what's coming next, what's around the bend. And this is exactly why ancient Jews wrote the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, which is entirely trying to periodize time, take time and turn it into chunks that make sense. And then lastly, ex eventu prophecy. This is a way to look, to kind of cast, to tell history as if, like, from an ancient viewpoint, to tell it as if a prophecy into the future. Now, the book of Daniel does contain some prophecies, that is to say, some predictions of the future. And some of those are miraculous. I'll spend more time talking about that next week. But a large chunk of what's presented as future prophecy was actually written retrospectively as history. Again, I'll spend more time talking about this, but what they did was they told this history of the world, really, in such a way that it helped them to understand how they thought God was working in the world at the present moment, and in order to say, we think we understand what God is about to do in the future. And that's how the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, and that's how all apocalyptic literature really is structured. So that's the basics of apocalyptic literature. We're going to see some details of this, and I'm going to take us through Daniel chapter 8 in just a moment. Apocalyptic literature comes from a bunch of different sources, but part of it you can see in prophetic literature. Some of the prophets, like Ezekiel had the vision of the wheels within wheels. That's like sort of apocalyptic. We call that proto-apocalyptic literature, having these strange visions. But it's not quite the same as apocalyptic literature, really. So the prophets give us like a toehold in this world where God is revealing special knowledge about the future. And some of this informed the creation of apocalyptic literature, which really we think Jews created apocalyptic literature around the time of the book of Daniel. Uh, Also, they adopted things like Babylonian astronomy. That they started to like learn a lot about science and the stars and the cosmos and things like this. And really, it was like right around the year 300 BC that Jews started to learn a lot of this stuff, and they started to incorporate it. And we've got some Dead Sea Scroll texts, some of the earliest apocalyptic texts that we have that really are kind of like more like looking at where the stars are and trying to figure out like the structure or the architecture of the cosmos. So that's a big part of like they're thinking about how the whole world is put together and how all of history is put together, and they're trying to think about it from the sense of like a prophet would think about it. That is to say that God has helped us to understand the world, and it's telling us about something that's about to happen. One last big piece of information to put in place before we really move into apocalyptic literature is called eschatology. Eschatology. So eschaton means the end in Greek. So the eschaton, the end. And throughout the Old Testament, we can see the prophets talk about the end. We call that prophetic eschatology. But we can very clearly see in a lot of Old Testament prophetic books, like the book of Ezekiel or the book of Jeremiah or the book of Isaiah, we can tell that they're talking about the end of a particular thing, the end of a kingdom, the end of Jerusalem being a city, the end of the way that everyone thinks that the world is working. We call this prophetic eschatology, the end of something that the prophets are declaring the end of. Only starting with the book of Daniel, only starting with the book of Daniel, do we get what we call apocalyptic eschatology. That means the end of everything, the end of time, the end of space, the end of material stuff as we know it, the end of the current order of time and the current social order in general, not just for one people. So this is a big change, a big different new idea from Genesis all the way to Daniel. We don't have a sense that the world is going to all end at once and God is going to judge everything. It just doesn't say that in the rest of the Old Testament. But in Daniel, it says it. There's gonna be a radical break to time and space, and something else is after. There is something on the other side of that, but it's like a remade world with new rules. Something else is happening that we just can't really understand. So this is what we call apocalyptic eschatology. And as you might understand, in the New Testament, we see a lot of this apocalyptic eschatology. We see Jesus, but also we see Paul. We see some of the what we call Catholic epistles, like the letters of First, Second, Third John. We see these a lot of these texts referencing some sort of day that's coming where things will all change. And we see the whole book of Revelation is written about this apocalyptic eschatology. There are lots of other ancient Jewish apocalypses that didn't make it into the Bible. I mentioned some of these. The apocalypse of Moses in the middle there. That's quoted in Jude, in the book in the New Testament Gospel, in the letter of Jude. But things like the Qumran War Scroll. Qumran is the Dead Sea Scroll. So there's no name for this thing in the text itself, but there's a war scroll. And then there's other apocalypses as well that are quite interesting. So there's a ton of these things that were made up at the same time, but Daniel really was the one that became canonical or that became part of the Bible. This is the only one that was considered good enough to be part of Scripture. And I mentioned a historical moment in time. Something happened, this very clear moment in history. Something happened. What happened was related to the rise of the Greeks and Alexander the Great. Okay, so in 333 BC, Alexander the Great became king, and it was a couple years before that he became king, but he set off on a series of conquests, and he decided to try to destroy the Persian Empire, which seemed ridiculous. Alexander was the king of a small, sort of Greek land called Macedonia. So they were like the margins of the Greek world. They were considered kind of like not really fully Greek by many of the Greeks. The Athenians thought the Macedonians were kind of silly and backwards, hill people. And Alexander becomes king, and his dad Philip had left him with a huge debt. And Alexander was about to just lose the kingdom that he had just inherited, so he needed money fast, and he decided to invade the Persian Empire. Crazy idea. And he ended up, for the first time in history, a Greek speaking person conquered the ancient Near East, conquered Egypt, ended up conquering the Persian Empire, ended up taking immense amounts of land, even invaded the Indus River Valley. And when he conquered all these different areas, he brought with him a completely new kind of idea or ideology, a completely different new way of like thinking about what it was to be a kingdom or an empire. He decided to try to invite people to become Greeks, and at least not everyone, but to invite the elites of the local cultures that he conquered to become Greeks. But then he also decided to kind of adopt some of local culture himself. So Alexander famously married wives from Babylon and from all the way up into what's modern day Tibet in Afghanistan. So he married women from all over the world. He adopted customs of like what kingship was and made his own Greek soldiers very mad because they were proud to be Greek. So he started to kind of mix Greek culture with these other cultures, and he invited other people to become Greek or Greekish. That is to say, anyone could wear Greek clothes. They could make gymnasia or places where young people learned to do Greek sports, but also learned about Greek culture. And people had access to becoming culturally Greek. And what it meant to be Greek was just to speak Greek and read Greek and know Greek culture. So anyone could become Greek at that point. This is a new idea, a very different idea in the world. You can see here, this is one of the earliest Jewish paintings that we have. And this is Saul, I mean Samuel choosing David. David's the guy in the middle, and that's Saul kind of holding up a horn of oil. And this is a painting from a Jewish synagogue in Dura Europos, a Greek-speaking town in what's now today Syria, right in the banks of the Euphrates River. But Jewish culture started to mix with Greek culture because the elites of the Jews, Alexander and his his generals, invite these Greek Jewish leaders to learn Greek, to dress in Greek ways, to become culturally Greeks. So this both is an opportunity and it's considered to be a threat by some Jews. So I mentioned Alexander the Great conquering the ancient Near East and conquering Israel as well. Actually, Israel surrendered and Jerusalem surrendered right away to Alexander the Great and said, please be our king. So Alexander took over right away there. But he died suddenly, Alexander, and there was chaos afterwards. We'll talk about that in a minute. And there's a second major crisis moment. So the Greeks rule over Jerusalem and without too much, it seems, trouble for a long time. But then in 167 BC, there was a persecution. A Greek king named Antiochus IV decided to persecute the Jewish faith. So I'm going to talk about this more in just a minute, but just to know, this is a moment where things broke. Somebody persecuted the Jewish faith, persecuted people for being Jewish, which, as far as we know, had never happened in the history of the world. No one had been persecuted for their religion before. It just wasn't an idea that anyone had ever had. There was a resistance movement that developed out after this and in response to this, and that became the Maccabean Revolt or the Hasmonean Revolt. So Maccabeus, Hasmoneus, or Hasmonean, those are the same family. It was a family that decided to revolt, and they ended up winning. They beat the Greek kingdoms, and they ended up developing and instituting a kingdom of Israel for the first time in a long time. And then in 63 BC, Pompey, the guy who ended up fighting with Caesar and was part of the triumvirate with Julius Caesar, Pompey came, and he was a general at the time, and he took over Palestine, including Jerusalem, and ended this independent Jewish state. So for 100 years, there was an independent Jewish state. It was the Romans that put Herod in charge. And that's why Herod was a king when Jesus was born. Herod's sort of half Jewish, and he was put there by the Romans because he was real rich, but also because he loved Rome. So he was a client king for them. So all to say, these kind of moments in history revolve around this one main moment where there was a persecution of the Jewish faith, persecution of people for being Jews. But it all starts with Alexander. Here's a famous mosaic image of Alexander. This is from a couple hundred years later, but this is the Battle of Issus, how somebody was thinking that he would have looked. And here's a little map of him conquering the known world at that point in time. He put together the largest empire the world had ever seen at that point. Estimated 25% of the population of the world was under Alexander's crown. Quite amazing. And here's an example of this, what we call Hellenization or Greekification, Greekish. Hellenization literally means Greekish. So it's a hybridization of Greek culture and other cultures. In Jerusalem, this would have been Greek culture and Jewish culture. And this right here says Esther. So this is a tombstone of a Jewish woman who was so proud of her Jewish faith that she put the menorah on her tombstone, which is a very Jewish symbol, but wrote her name in Greek instead of Hebrew. So Esther. So just to say, this kind of mixing of Greek and Jewish culture was a really important part of Alexander's paradigm. He wanted the world to be this mixture of Greek and local cultures in order to unify the world really in his image. When Alexander died, he left chaos. He didn't have a successor that was, sort of the full. He didn't have a full-grown kid who was able to take over the kingdom, and his kids were eventually assassinated when they were still young. So his generals took over, and they fought with each other, as you might imagine. And there were two main kingdoms that formed in the area around Jerusalem. They were in the wake of Alexander's death, and they were his general Ptolemy, and like one of his best friends from his youth, Ptolemy, seized Egypt and took that over and made that his home base. And then Seleucus, Alexander's main general, ended up founding the Seleucid kingdom. And the borderline between the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom, both of which were founded by Alexander's friends and generals. Both those kingdoms, the borderline was basically right over Jerusalem. So it's bad news for Jerusalem. There was some fighting that happened in that century and led to some chaos. For about 100 years, the Ptolemies, here's a Greek guy wearing an Egyptian hat, right? I mean, so this is what the Ptolemaic Empire was. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies, the last of these Macedonian kings and queens that adopted Egyptian ways. And for about 100 years, they ruled over Jerusalem. And after that, the Seleucids conquered Jerusalem and took it over. And from 200 to 164 BC, everything seemed to be going okay. But then something happened. This guy, here's this coin, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means that like God manifests, like God showing up in human form. He thought a lot of himself. He was called by some of his followers Epimanes, which means madman. He decided to persecute the Jewish faith. He thought that the Jews themselves and their strange unique faith, their monotheism, their refusal to worship Greek gods, their refusal to take on some Greek ways. They took on a bunch of Greek ways, but there are certain things that they wouldn't take on, mostly religious things. Led Antiochus IV to imagine that it was their religion that was causing them to be obstinate, and they were going to rebel against him. He tried to seize a bunch of money, like basically like kind of take a bunch of taxes, and he tried to send a guy to like take these taxes from the Jerusalem temple and put up a symbol of him, God manifest, in the temple to show his rule over the Jerusalem temple. Well, the Jews didn't like that. They didn't like images of foreign kings and foreign gods. They didn't like the idea that their money in the temple that was given to Yahweh was now going to be taken by this foreign king. And so they fought this representative off and sent him away. And he went back to Antiochus. Antiochus IV said, it's their religion. And he was the first person in the history of the world that we know of that said it's a religion that's the problem. And so he started to persecute the faith of the Jews. He made it illegal to have a Torah scroll. If he found your Torah scroll, he would kill you. You get executed. If women circumcised their children, they would be thrown together, mother and child, off of the walls of Jerusalem and to their death. It was an actual persecution of a faith. Like I said, nobody had ever thought of this before. The Babylonians never persecuted a faith. They didn't care who you worshipped. They asked you to worship their gods too, but they didn't stop you from worshiping your local gods. The Greeks, even the Romans, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, they all thought that the local gods actually existed. And they thought that your local gods, you should worship your local gods, but you also need to worship our gods. Antiochus IV tried to stop people from worshiping their local gods, and it was only the Jews. And this broke Jewish faith. So I'm going to skip a little bit of this. So this persecution from 167 to 164, Antiochus IV persecuted Jews for their faith, and in result, there was. I'm going to get back to the devil later. Don't worry. This guy, Judah Maccabee, or Judah the Hammer, rose up against, and it was really his dad who began this revolt. But Judah was the guy who took over and became this general of a Jewish army. He came from a priestly family that revolted and fought against the Greek armies of Antiochus IV and ended up actually reconquering Jerusalem. And that's what Hanukkah is. Hanukkah means rededication. It's the rededication of the temple that had been desecrated by Antiochus IV. They rededicated the temple. That's Hanukkah. and they ended up then reinstituting temple worship there. So these 3.5 years of total chaos caused by the persecution of the Jewish faith rattled Jews because, again, it didn't make any sense that someone was persecuting a faith. And then their question was, if God does everything, the good and the bad alike, which was an old Jewish thing to say, right? God does the good and the bad. You know, Job says God, gives everything. From God's hand is everything. God is the one who heals. God's the one who binds up. God did the exile. So that was a Jewish thing to say. God does everything. And somebody said, did God do this? God persecuted the faith of God's worshipers. God killed babies for being circumcised. That doesn't make any sense. God, God punishing disobedience made sense to these ancient Jews, but God punishing people for being faithful just didn't make any sense to them. And so they said, wait a minute, something, there's got to be something out there that's fighting God. And it's not just a person. This is some sort of spiritual warfare. And at that moment, in 167 BC, for the first time ever, a Jew said, there's an evil power that is strong and yet not quite as strong as God, but there's an evil power that's strong that is fighting against God and for a time seems to be prevailing. And this is the beginning of the theology of the devil or Satan or all these other names you can think of, right? But this evil power, there's an evil power that's not as strong as God, but that is rebelling against God, and it's stronger than me. It's stronger than people. It's bigger than the evil that's just in human hearts. So knowing all this, I'm going to lead us through a little reading of Daniel 8, and then next week we're going to come back and we're going to read Daniel 7. All right, so Daniel 8. It starts off in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So this is kind of back in Daniel 5, the writing on the wall. It's like at that point in time. So during that time, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. So chapter 7 is the first vision, chapter 8 is the second. I'm starting with chapter 8 because it's a little easier to understand than chapter 7. So in the vision, I was looking and I saw myself in Susa, the capital of the province of Elam. So he's in a Persian town. And he looked up and he saw a ram standing behind the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long. One was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All the beasts were powerless to withstand it. So he's seeing a symbol, and that symbol is the symbol of a foreign kingdom. And that foreign kingdom is Persia. How do I know that it's Persia? Because an angel comes a little bit later and interprets the vision. And this angel Gabriel, it's named in verse 16, Gabriel comes to help this guy understand the vision. And the angel says, verse 20, as for that ram you saw with the 2 horns, that's the thing at the beginning that we just read, that is the kings of Media and Persia. So the Medes were similar to the Persians. They were like the cousins of the Persians, and the Medes and the Persians teamed up to defeat Babylon. So you saw the kings of Media and Persia. It explains it. And then there's a male goat that came up next, and that is the king of Greece. And the great horn between its eyes is its first king. That's to people living in Jerusalem. The first king of the Greeks was Alexander. That's the only one they'd ever heard of. He was the first guy to come to their neighborhood from Greece, first king. So the male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn. There's a great horn, and so here you see this image. This is an image depicting Daniel 8. Much later, this is a Reformation woodcut. We see this ram with his big horn. That's Alexander attacking the kings of Persia, and he destroys them. And then something happens. There's a crazy horn that begins to pop up out of this male goat. If we look back at the beginning of Daniel 8, this is this ram can't withstand the power of the goat, and this male goat, verse 8, grew exceedingly great. But at the height of its power, the great horn was broken. That's Alexander the Great died suddenly in the middle of Babylon, and he really did die suddenly when he was still quite young. And in its place, there came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. These are those other empires of the successor kingdoms after Alexander the Great. Out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. That's Israel. So one of these horns takes over Jerusalem. And it threw down to the earth some of the heavenly hosts, some of the angels. there's a Greek king that's going to fight the angels, and it's going to trample on them, even against the prince of the host, that is to say, even against the chief of the angels. It acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away and overthrew the place of the sanctuary. So this person's going to desecrate the temple. That's Antiochus IV. He stopped sacrifice there. He began to sacrifice pigs there. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth on the ground and kept prospering in what it did. So Antiochus IV is going to look like he's going to win for a long time. And then I heard a holy one speaking, an angel. And the angel said, "How long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, or the desolating sacrilege, or whatever, the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled? So, how long is the temple going to be destroyed for?" And this angel answers, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings." So, 2,300 evenings and mornings. So, an evening and then a morning, that's one day. So, if you take 2,300 and you cut it in half, that's 1,150. So 1,150 days is, I think, what we're talking about here. And that's roughly 3.5 years. So this is a prediction here that for 3.5 years, the temple is going to remain desolate after Antiochus IV desecrates it. But then what's going to happen? The angel Gabriel comes and interprets this for Daniel. And Daniel's freaking out because Daniel is, hundreds of years before this. But the angel says, verse 21, "The male goat's the king of Greece. The horn is the first king. As to the horn that was broken, and in its place which four others rose, four kingdoms shall arise from Alexander the Great's nation, but not with his power. No one's going to be as strong as Alexander. But at the end of their rule, when their transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise." This is Antiochus IV. "He shall grow strong in power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and he shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones." There is going to be a powerful foreign king that rises up, is able to fight angels. So he's got this kind of spiritual power to him, and he's going to dominate Jerusalem. He's going to take away the offerings. "By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper, but without warning, he shall destroy the many and even rise up against the prince of princes." That's God. So this is a demonic figure who's going to attack God. "But he shall be broken and not by human hands." It doesn't say who's going to break, but who would have the power to break this horrific evil. And it's not a human. Well, that's God. So this is a way of gesturing that God is going to be the one, not you. You can't kill the Greeks, right? Now, the interesting thing is the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, they actually are a kingdom that rises up and takes this place. The book of Daniel says that the real true victor is God. It's not people. And any people that try to defeat evil and create a good kingdom in its place, they're going to end up being corrupted too. And that's true. It happened to the Hasmoneans. It happened to the Maccabees. They ended up being very quickly corrupted by their own power. So this idea is that God is the only one who can actually fully set things straight. We need to help, but we can help first and foremost by keeping our faith. So then it says that Daniel was dismayed. And that's it. That's the end of one of these visions. That's our first apocalyptic vision here. Let me ask, I got a couple of minutes here, but any questions, comments? We just covered a whole lot of ground. I know next week we don't have to do all the whole intro to apocalyptic. We can really start with Daniel chapter 7 and read it together. And we can spend a lot more time asking questions about the text. Questions or comments? Y'all understand more about apocalyptic literature now and how it works? Y'all feel like, are you all apocalyptic out there?
We got one question.
Yes.
Did the summary that you just gave us
Yes.
cover the rest of the book of Daniel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. This moment of Antiochus IV's persecution is the moment that consumes Daniel chapters 7 through 12. And all of Daniel chapters 7 through 12 was written probably during 167, the second half of 167 BC. And that one historical moment really, like we'll see it when we read the rest of Daniel chapter 7 through 12. Everything is about this one crisis. And I'd say that in the New Testament, or the book of Revelation, it really is probably about a crisis that happens with the persecution of followers of Jesus by the Roman state. So we're seeing like very, very specific moments of persecution and people risking their lives for their faith, and this message that says, "Hold on, and God's going to help."
Would the story of Jesus's birth, where the angels interpret for them, would that be considered sort of apocalyptic in Luke or whatever? Is that?
It's got a connection to apocalyptic. It's not part of a genre. It's not part of an apocalypse, but it's got a connection to that. And that connection is, yes, this angelic revelation. We see the name Gabriel. So the angel Gabriel that appears. It's the same Gabriel that you see here in Daniel chapter 8. And it's an angel that's revealing a truth of the cosmos, that Jesus is the one. And so there is a connection. That main connection really is that it's understood that this time of Jesus's birth is another one of these times of major crisis, that many people are at the edge of their faith and they don't know if they can hang on. And so there's a intervention that's going to happen, but it needs to be interpreted because it doesn't make sense all by itself. There's a baby that's born, that's it. So the angel Gabriel shows up again, and shows up in a way that angel Gabriel is trying to explain and interpret this strange sign that is going to help bolster people's faith. But yeah, excellent question.
Quiet.
No, go ahead, Don.
You described the book of Daniel
Yes.
as a series of revelations, as it were, of a certain period in time in history,
Right.
things that happened. I think I heard you say
Mhm.
that may be similar to the book of Revelation.
Yes.
That was describing in apocalyptic literature, in that genre
Mhm.
of events that occurred, past tense,
Yes.
not necessarily of our future.
Right. Yes. Yes. Very good point. Yes. So there is a moment, and Daniel 8 doesn't do this. So Daniel 8 does not talk about our future. It talks about this one moment. As we'll see, other parts of the book of Daniel and other parts of the book of Revelation do venture into this, what we would call apocalyptic eschatology, like the end of time itself, something that for us is still in the future. But excellent point. Daniel chapter 8 does not ever mention this world beyond or an end of all time. Daniel 7 does. So next week, we'll see one of these apocalyptic stories that kind of jumps in time from 167 BC to the end and actually says the end. This is about the end. But great question. Yeah. So I would say there's parts of Revelation and parts of Daniel that really are focused on this one moment of crisis. And then there are some other moments where the vista opens up, and there is this like vision of something that really truly is beyond. Well, it's a lot to take in. I know. Yeah. If you think this week and you have questions about it, feel free to jot them down, and I'll start next week by saying, hey, any questions about all that crazy apocalyptic stuff we got into? But I look forward to seeing y'all next week.
Thank you, Brennan.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Peace. Peace.